husband had been stealing my money for over a year, and I only found out because his girlfriend used my credit card to book a hotel room in another city while I was sitting right next to him on our couch. I watched the charge hit my phone. I watched him smile at me, and I realized in that moment I wasn't married to a man. I was married to a professional liar. What he didn't know was that I worked in finance, and I was about to track every dollar he ever touched. By the time I was done, he wouldn't just lose his marriage. He would lose his job, his reputation, and every lie he built his life on. But before I tell you how I destroyed my own husband from the inside out, let me take you back to the day I realized I was funding his second life. The first charge hit my phone on a Tuesday night, while my husband was sitting right next to me on the couch, smiling at his screen like nothing in the world was wrong. And for a few seconds I honestly thought it had to be a mistake, because there was no possible reason my credit card should be getting charged for a hotel room in a city we weren't even in. We hadn't planned a trip. We hadn't talked about going anywhere. And Daniel had spent the entire day at home working on his laptop. So when I saw $487.32 Riverside Hotel pending light up my screen, something deep in my chest tightened in a way I had never felt before. I looked at him, then at my phone, then back at him again, and he was still smiling, relaxed, scrolling through something on his screen, completely unaware that my entire reality had just shifted. 3 minutes later, another charge appeared. $129.50 Riverside Hotel dining. And that was when the truth started to sink in. Slow and heavy, because glitches don't repeat themselves with matching timestamps and locations. "Hey," I said, forcing my voice to stay casual. "Did you just use my card for something?" He didn't even look up when he answered. "No." "Why?" It was the way he said it that did it. Smooth. Immediate. Without even a flicker of hesitation. Like he had already rehearsed that lie 100 times before. I nodded, smiled, and told him it must be nothing. Because I knew in that moment that whatever was happening, I needed to see all of it before I said a word. I took my phone into the bathroom, locked the door, and watched in real time as more charges rolled in. A taxi from the same hotel, room service, a spa package, all coming from the same city Daniel had never mentioned, all being quietly paid for by me. That was when I finally understood that my husband was just cheating on me. He was running a whole other life on my dime. And the worst part was that he was doing it right in front of me, confident that I would never connect the dots. I sat there on the edge of the bathtub, staring at the screen, feeling sick, not because of the money, but because of how carefully he had built this lie. Daniel and I had been married for 12 years. And for most of that time, I really believed we were a team. 2 adults building a stable, boring, respectable life together. We met in our late 20s. We both had decent jobs, and we bonded over the same simple dream. A quiet house, financial security, and no drama. That was the version of him everyone else saw too. At family gatherings, he was the calm one. The one who listened more than he talked. The one who helped clear the table and carried dishes to the sink while everyone else argued about politics. At work events, he was polite, professional, the guy who shook hands and remembered names. The kind of man people trusted without thinking twice. And at home, at least on the surface, he was steady, never raising his voice, never slamming doors, never giving me anything obvious to be afraid of, which was why it took me so long to see what was really happening. It started slowly, so slowly that I didn't even realize it was happening at first. Just little things, small excuses, tiny financial shifts that were easy to explain away. Daniel always said his job was unpredictable, that bonuses were delayed, that clients paid late, that his income came in waves. And because I had a stable salary, I started covering more and more of our shared expenses without even noticing when it became the norm. First, it was just groceries, then utilities, then subscriptions, then eventually the bulk of the rent. And every time I asked if things were tight, he had a reason, a story, a promise that it would even out soon. "I'm building something," he would say. "Just give me a little more time." And I believed him, because trusting your spouse feels like the bare minimum you're supposed to do. Looking back, the signs were everywhere. The late nights when he claimed to be on conference calls, but never let me hear the other side of the conversation. The business trips that never came with photos or souvenirs. The way he guarded his phone like it held state secrets. But when you love someone, you don't go looking for cracks in the foundation. You assume the house is solid until it starts to collapse. The night I saw those hotel charges was the first real crack. I stayed in that bathroom for almost 20 minutes, watching the transactions settle, watching the total climb, watching my husband quietly spend hundreds of dollars on a life I was part of. When I finally went back into the living room, he was still there, still relaxed, still pretending nothing had changed. I sat down next to him, leaned my head against his shoulder, and felt a strange, terrifying calm settle over me. Because at that point, I wasn't heartbroken yet. I was curious. I wanted to know how far this went, how long it had been going on, and how someone I had shared a bed with for over a decade could be so comfortable lying to my face. So I decided to play along. Over the next few days, I didn't confront him, I didn't argue, and I didn't change my behavior at all, even though every part of me wanted to scream. Instead, I started paying attention. I noticed how he would leave the room to take certain calls, how he would smile at his phone in a way he never smiled at me anymore, how his business trips always seemed to line up with weekends I was especially busy at work. And because of what I did for a living, I had access to something he never thought about. Data. Every credit card statement, every bank transfer, every digital receipt was a breadcrumb. And once I started following them, a picture began to form that was far worse than I had imagined. There were hotel stays going back months, all in the same other city, all on the same weekends, all paid for by my accounts. There were restaurants I had never been to, ride shares I had never taken, stores I had never shopped at. He was just meeting someone. He was maintaining a full relationship somewhere else, with dinners, gifts, and weekends away, all funded by me. And the more I dug, the more I realized something even more disturbing. Daniel was just stealing from me. He was stealing from his company too. I recognized some of the charges because they matched the expense codes he had once mentioned in passing. Business lunches, travel reimbursements, client entertainment. Only now they were being used to hide personal spending. My husband was just a cheater. He was a fraud. And he was sloppy. That realization didn't make me cry. It made me focus. Because if he had built this entire double life on lies and stolen money, then every part of it was fragile. And all it would take to destroy it was the right evidence in the right hands. By the time Daniel came home that Friday night, telling me he was leaving early the next morning for another work trip, I already knew exactly which hotel he would be checking into. I kissed him goodbye, wished him luck, and waited. And as soon as he walked out the door, I opened my laptop and started collecting everything. The moment Daniel walked out the front door with his overnight bag and that familiar fake work smile, I didn't feel sad or even angry. I felt awake. Because when you finally realize you're living inside someone else's lie, your mind stops making excuses and starts paying attention. I stood there for a few seconds listening to his car fade down the street. Then, I locked the door behind him, sat at the kitchen table, opened my laptop, and took a deep breath. Because I knew this was the night everything would change. I started with his email. the one he used for work. Because people who lie for a living always hide the truth behind professionalism. And what I found, there was a carefully maintained second world that had been running for almost a year without me knowing. There were hotel confirmations, dozens of them, always in the same other city, always at the same upscale hotel, always booked for 2 people, and always lining up perfectly with the business trips he had told me about. Then there were restaurant reservations, wine bars, rooftop lounges, romantic places we hadn't visited together in years, all booked in advance, all paid for with my credit card. I scrolled through months of this, my stomach tightening with every new receipt. Because it was just one mistake or one bad weekend. It was a lifestyle. And then I found her. Her name was Lena. And her emails filled his inbox with the kind of intimacy that only comes from someone who thinks she's building a future with you. Good morning messages, jokes, photos, and long conversations about how hard it was for him to pretend to still be married. He told her our relationship was basically over, that I was emotionally distant, that I depended on him financially, that he was just waiting for the right moment to leave me without causing unnecessary drama. I had to pause when I read that, because in reality it was my salary, my credit, and my accounts that were paying for his entire life, including his romance with her. But the affair was only the surface. What really made my hands start to shake were the files labeled expenses and client reports. Because as soon as I opened them, I saw something I recognized instantly. A pattern. Daniel had been submitting hotel stays, meals, taxis, and even gift purchases to his company as business expenses, claiming they were for client meetings and work travel, while at the same time charging them to my credit cards. He was getting reimbursed for costs he was never actually paying, which meant he was stealing from his employer just as much as he was stealing from me. And he was good at it. He split charges into smaller amounts so they wouldn't stand out, rotated between accounts, and wrote vague descriptions that made everything look legitimate at a glance. For months he had been quietly double-minus dipping, building a second life on top of 2 separate streams of stolen money, confident that no one would ever connect the dots. Except I was sitting right there with all the dots in front of me. I spent hours cross-minus checking his reimbursement reports with my bank statements, matching dates, locations, and amounts, building a clear timeline that showed exactly how his lies were funded. By the time I finished, it was past 2 in the morning, and my coffee had gone cold, but my mind was sharper than it had ever been. When Daniel came home the next night, acting tired and distracted, telling me about meetings that never happened, I played my role perfectly. I smiled, asked how his trip went, and even made dinner, all while knowing that his entire world was already starting to crack. But I didn't confront him, because I was just planning to leave him. I was planning to expose him. Over the next 2 weeks I kept digging, quietly, patiently, the way someone does when they know the truth will hurt more if it's complete. I tracked his location whenever he claimed to be somewhere else. I downloaded backups of his messages. I saved copies of his expense reports. And I recorded phone calls where he casually lied about where he wasn't who he was with. Every new piece of evidence made the picture clearer. Daniel was just cheating. He was running a long-term financial scam, using me and his company as the banks that funded it. I also learned more about Lena. From their messages I could tell she thought she was in a serious relationship, one that was moving towards something permanent, and that made what he was doing even more disgusting. Because he was just betraying me, he was manipulating her too. I considered contacting her then, but I held back, because I wanted the timing to be perfect. Daniel had a big quarterly review coming up at work, a meeting where his department's expenses and reimbursements would be closely examined, and I knew from his own notes that he was nervous about it. So I waited. I let him believe he was safe. Then, On the morning of that meeting, after he left the house in his best suit, confident and calm, I finally sent the email. I attached everything: the receipts, the hotel bookings, the messages, the spreadsheets, the timelines, all of it, and I sent it to his company's HR department and his direct supervisor with one simple sentence: "These are not business expenses." Then I sat back and waited. It didn't take long. Within an hour, my phone started lighting up with his calls, his texts, his voice messages, going from confused to angry to desperate. But I didn't answer a single one, because I knew that at that moment, in a conference room somewhere, people who controlled his career were opening the same files I had been staring at for weeks. And Daniel was about to realize that the life he built on lies was finally being seen. The first call came at 10:47 I was sitting in my office, pretending to focus on spreadsheets, when my phone started buzzing on the desk, and I watched Daniel's name light up the screen over and over again like a warning signal I had been waiting months to see. I didn't pick up. I just sat there, letting it ring, feeling a strange cold satisfaction settle in my chest, because I knew exactly what was happening on his end. He was watching his carefully constructed world fall apart in real time, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The calls kept coming, one after another, 7 in the first 20 minutes, and then the text started. "What did you do? Call me RIGHTNOW. This is insane, you need to call me back. You're ruining everything." I read each one as it came in. Calm, detached, like I was watching a stranger's life implode instead of my own husband's. And maybe that was the strangest part of all. I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel scared. I just felt done. By lunch, the messages had shifted from panic to rage. "You sent LIS to my company. I can PROVE this is fake. You're going to regret this." But I knew he couldn't prove anything, because everything I sent was real. Every receipt, every timeline, every double charge, every lie he told his employer while stealing from both of us. It was all documented, time-stamped, and undeniable. And the most beautiful part was that I hadn't editorialized a single thing. I didn't write a long emotional letter. I didn't accuse him of anything directly. I just sent the evidence with one sentence. Clinical, factual, impossible to argue with. These are not business expenses. 5 words that ended 12 years of marriage and a career he thought was untouchable. Around 2 p.m. my phone rang again. But this time it wasn't Daniel. It was a number I didn't recognize. And when I answered, a calm professional voice introduced herself as someone from his company's legal department. They wanted to know if I was willing to provide additional documentation. I said yes. They asked if I had access to the credit card statements in question. I said yes. They asked if I would be willing to testify if this became a formal investigation. I said yes. And then, very carefully, very politely, they thanked me for coming forward. The woman on the phone explained that they had been reviewing Daniel's expense reports for the past 3 hours, and that what I had sent them had opened up a much larger investigation than anyone had anticipated. She told me that the finance department was now pulling records going back to years, that they had already identified patterns of fraudulent claims, and that my documentation had given them the exact roadmap they needed to build a case. "We've seen cases like this before," she said, her voice steady and professional, "but rarely with this level of detail. You've essentially done half our work for us." I didn't tell her that I had spent weeks building that documentation, that I had cross-referenced every charge with his work calendar, that I had tracked his location data against his expense claims, that I had built a timeline so airtight that even the best lawyer couldn't argue with it. I just said, "I'm glad I could help." After I hung up, I sat there staring at my computer screen, watching the cursor blink, and I realized that this was the moment everything became real. Daniel wasn't just losing his job. He was facing actual legal consequences. The kind that come with criminal charges and permanent records. The kind that follow you for the rest of your life. And I had set it all in motion with one email. That realization should have felt heavier than it did. But instead I just felt clear. Like I had finally stopped carrying a weight I didn't even know was there. I went back to work, answered emails, attended meetings, and acted like everything was normal. While across town my husband's entire world was being systematically dismantled by people who were much better at this than he ever was. By 4 p.m. the texts had stopped. By 5 p.m. the calls had stopped. And by 6 p.m., when I walked out of my office and got into my car, I realized that Daniel had finally understood that I wasn't going to answer, that I wasn't going to engage, that I was done. The silence was almost louder than the noise had been. I drove home slowly, taking the long route, watching the city pass by outside my window, and I thought about all the times I had made this same Dr. while Daniel was at home waiting for me, pretending to be the man I thought I married. How many nights had I walked through that door and smiled at him while he smiled back, both of us performing a version of marriage that only one of us knew was fake? How many dinners had we shared where he told me about his day, his meetings, his clients, all while knowing that half of what he said was a lie? How many times had he kissed me goodnight and then waited for me to fall asleep so he could text her, plan their next trip, spend my money on a life I wasn't part of? The math was sickening. When I pulled into the driveway, I sat in the car for a few extra minutes, staring at the house, preparing myself for whatever was about to happen next. I didn't know if Daniel would be there, didn't know if he would be calm or angry, didn't know if he would beg or threaten or just silently pack his things, but I knew that no matter what happened, I wasn't going to apologize, because I hadn't done anything wrong. I had simply stopped letting him get away with it. I walked inside and found him in the kitchen, standing by the counter with his phone in his hand, his face pale and his eyes hollow. And the second he saw me, he started talking, fast, desperate, like he had been rehearsing this speech for hours. "Sarah, please, you have to listen to me. You don't understand what you've done. They're saying I committed fraud. They're saying I could go to jail. They're freezing my accounts. They're taking everything. And it's all because of you. Because you sent them something you didn't even understand." I set my bag down on the table and looked at him, really looked at him, and I saw something I had never seen before. Fear. Not fear of losing me, not fear of facing consequences, but fear of being caught, of being exposed, of having to answer for all the lies he had told. I understood exactly what I sent them. I said quietly, "I sent them proof that you've been stealing from the company for over a year, submitting fake expense reports, getting reimbursed for charges you never paid, using your position to fund a secret relationship with someone else. And I sent them every single transaction that proves it. That's not what happened. Yes, it is. I have the receipts. Daniel, I have your emails. I have the hotel bookings. I have the messages where you bragged to your friends about how easy it was to get away with it. I have everything." His face went from pale to gray. "You went through my personal files. You stole from me for over a year. That's different." "No, it's not. You used my credit cards, my money, my trust, to build a life with someone else. And you did it while submitting fake expense reports to your company. You weren't just cheating on me, Daniel. You were committing fraud. And now you're facing the consequences." He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it, then opened it again. And I could see the exact moment he realized that nothing he said was going to change what I had already done. "They're going to destroy me," he whispered. "Good." The word hung in the air between us, cold and final, and I watched his face crumble, watched the mask he had worn for so long finally crack apart. I loved you, he said, and it sounded like a question. No, you didn't. You loved what I gave you. Stability. Money. Cover. Someone who wouldn't ask too many questions. But you never loved me. Because people who love each other don't do what you did. He stared at me for a long moment. And then, without another word, he turned and walked toward the bedroom. I heard drawers opening, heard things being thrown into bags, heard the sounds of someone packing a life in a hurry, and I stood there in the kitchen, calm, waiting. 20 minutes later, he came back out with 2 suitcases and a backpack. His face blank, his movements mechanical, and he stopped at the door, looked back at me one last time, and said, "You're going to regret this." "No," I said, "I'm really not." And then he left. I heard his car start, heard the engine fade down the street, and then the house was quiet again, emptier than it had ever been, but also lighter, like a storm had finally passed. I walked through the rooms, turning on lights, opening windows, letting fresh air in, and I thought about how strange it was that the end of a 12-year marriage could feel less like a tragedy and more like relief. I wasn't sad. I wasn't heartbroken. I was just done. Over the next few weeks, the investigation moved faster than I expected. Daniel's company hired a forensic accountant to audit his expense reports, and they found exactly what I had found: a systematic pattern of fraud going back 18 months. Fake receipts, duplicate claims, personal charges disguised as business expenses. All of it carefully hidden in plain sight. The total came to just over $40,000 in fraudulent reimbursements. And that didn't even include the money he had stolen from me. They also discovered that he had been coaching a junior employee to do the same thing, teaching someone else how to manipulate the system, how to split charges to avoid red flags, how to write vague descriptions that looked legitimate at a glance. That junior employee came forward during the investigation, admitted everything, and provided even more documentation that corroborated what I had already sent. Daniel's plan to claim I had fabricated everything fell apart before it even started. By the end of the month, his company had filed a formal police report, frozen his severance, and sent demand letters for full repayment of the stolen funds. Daniel's lawyer tried to negotiate, tried to argue that it was a misunderstanding, tried to claim that the company's expense system was too confusing and that Daniel had made honest mistakes. But the evidence was too clear, too detailed, too damning. There were no honest mistakes when you submit the same hotel statewide, once as a reimbursement and once on your spouse's credit card. There were no honest mistakes when you write off romantic dinners as client entertainment. There were no honest mistakes when you teach someone else how to do it. The prosecutor agreed. Daniel was formally charged with embezzlement, fraud, and theft, and because the amount was over $40,000, the charges carried the possibility of real prison time. I found out from a news article, a small piece buried in the business section of the local paper, just a few paragraphs with his name, his former job title, and a brief description of the charges. I read it 3 times, saved a screenshot, and then closed the page, and I felt nothing, not satisfaction, not vindication, not even anger. Just a quiet sense of finality, like watching the last page of a book you never wanted to read in the first place. But I still wasn't done, because there was one more person who needed to know the truth. Lena. I had been watching her social media for weeks, and from what I could tell, she genuinely believed she was in a committed relationship with a man who was almost divorced, a man who was finally ready to move forward, a man who had been lying to her just as much as he had been lying to me. So one night, after finishing a glass of wine and staring at my phone for 20 minutes, I finally sent her a message. I kept it simple. No drama. No accusations, Just the facts. Helena, my name is Sarah. I'm Daniel's wife. We're still married, and I think there are some things you should know. Then I attached the same documents I had sent to his company. The hotel bookings, the restaurant charges, the timeline showing that every romantic weekend she thought they were building together had been funded by my credit cards. I also included screenshots of messages where he called her clingy and exhausting when talking to his friends. Messages where he joked about keeping her happy until he figured out his exit strategy. Messages where he rated her performance in bed, like she was a product he was reviewing. Because if I was going to blow up his life, I was going to make sure every lie he told got exposed. Every person he manipulated got to see exactly who he really was. I hit end before I could guess myself. For 2 days I heard nothing, and I started to wonder if she would just delete the message and pretend it never happened. If she would choose to believe his version of events instead of the evidence right in front of her. But then, late on a Thursday night, my phone buzzed with a reply. I had no idea. I'm so sorry. He told me you were separated. He told me he was sleeping in the guest room. He told me you didn't care anymore. He told me you were the one who wanted the divorce. I feel like such an idiot. I believed every word he said. I read it twice, and even though part of me wanted to be angry at her, I couldn't. Because she had been lied to just like I had. Just in a different way. You're not an idiot. I wrote back. He's a professional liar. And he's very good at it. But now you know the truth. What are you going to do? She asked. I already did it. He lost his job. He's under investigation for fraud. And I'm filing for divorce. He doesn't get to walk away from this like nothing happened. There was a long pause. And then she sent one more message. Good. He deserves everything that's coming to him. And then, after another pause, thank you for telling me. I know you didn't have to. Yes, I did. I wrote back. Because he would have kept lying to you too. And you deserve better than that. We didn't talk after that. But a few days later I noticed she had blocked Daniel on every platform, deleted every photo of them together, and posted a vague quote about learning who people really are when the mask comes off. I smiled when I saw it, because she had figured it out too. The divorce was finalized 3 months later. Daniel tried to fight it at first, claiming I had violated his privacy, claiming I had sabotaged his career, claiming I owed him money for emotional distress and reputational damage. But his lawyer took one look at the evidence, one look at the criminal charges he was facing, and told him to settle, because when you're caught stealing from your spouse and your employer at the same time, you don't have a lot of leverage in court. We split the assets 50-50, which meant he got almost nothing because we didn't have much to begin with. And the debts he had racked up in my name stayed with him, along with the legal fees from both the divorce and the criminal case. By the time the papers were signed, Daniel had moved to another state, taken a job that paid a third of what he used to make, and stopped contacting me entirely. I heard through mutual friends that he was telling people I had overreacted, that I didn't understand the full story, that I destroyed his life over a mistake, that he was the victim of a vindictive ex-wife who couldn't handle the truth. But I didn't care, because everyone who mattered already knew the real story. His former colleagues, his former employer, his former girlfriend, and the prosecutor handling his case. The truth was documented, time-stamped, undeniable, and no amount of rewriting history was going to change what he had done. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I was sitting in my new apartment, the one I could finally afford on my own now that I wasn't funding someone else's double life, when I got notification on my phone. It was a news article. Small, local, barely 200 words. Former analyst sentenced in embezzlement case. I clicked on it, and there was Daniel's face staring back at me from the screen. The same professional headshot he used to use on LinkedIn. Calm, confident, trustworthy, the article said. He had pleaded guilty to avoid a trial. That he had been sentenced to 18 months in prison followed by 3 years of probation. That he was required to pay full restitution to his former employer. And that he would have a permanent criminal record. I read it 3 times, then saved it, then closed the tab. And I felt closure, not happiness, not satisfaction, just a quiet sense that the story was finally over, that justice had been served, that the man who had spent over a year lying to my face was finally being held accountable. Daniel had built his entire life on lies, on stolen money, on charm and manipulation, and he had done it so confidently that he thought he would never get caught. But he did get caught, and when he did, everything collapsed faster than he ever thought possible. I didn't destroy my husband. He destroyed himself. I just made sure everyone could see it. A year later, I ran into one of Daniel's old co-workers at a professional conference, someone I vaguely remembered from a holiday party years ago. And after a few minutes of awkward small talk, he leaned in and said something I wasn't expecting. You know, after everything came out about Daniel, 3 other people in the department came forward. He had been doing smaller versions of the same thing to them for years, borrowing money he never paid back, asking for loans for fake emergencies, always with some excuse, always promising it was temporary. You stopping him probably saved a lot of people from losing even more. I didn't know what to say, because I hadn't done it to save anyone else. I had done it because I was angry, because I had been betrayed, because I wanted him to face consequences for what he had done to me. But maybe that's how justice works sometimes. You stand up for yourself, and it turns out you're standing up for other people too. People you didn't even know needed it. I'm glad it helped, I said quietly. He nodded, then changed the subject, and we talked about work for a few more minutes before going our separate ways. But as I walked back to my hotel that night, I thought about what he had said, about the other people Daniel had hurt, about the pattern that had probably been going on for years before I ever noticed it. And I realized something I hadn't fully understood before. Daniel wasn't just a cheater or a liar. He was a predator, someone who identified people who trusted him and systematically took advantage of that trust until there was nothing left. He had done it to me. He had done it to Lena. He had done it to his co-workers. And he had probably done it to people before us that I would never even know about. But he couldn't do it anymore, because I had made sure the world knew exactly who he was. And that, more than anything else, felt like the real victory. I don't think about Daniel much anymore, and when I do, it's not with anger or regret, just a distant sense of relief that I got out when I did, that I didn't waste another year, another month, another day believing his lies. I rebuilt my life on my own terms, in my own apartment, with my own money and my own choices. And for the first time in over a decade, I didn't have to wonder if the person sleeping next to me was lying about where they were or who they were with or what they were doing with my money. I was finally free, and Daniel was exactly where he deserved to be, facing the consequences of every lie he ever told, every dollar he ever stole, every person he ever manipulated. Some people call what I did revenge. I call it justice. Because when someone builds their entire life on your trust, your money, and your silence, the most powerful thing you can do is take all 3 away. And that's exactly what I did.